In our last session, we were looking through the principle of taking responsibility, of looking at the Beatitudes and how taking responsibility is the next step for us in terms of our journey of freedom. And I wonder how you're getting on. How are you doing with looking at the different things in our lives that we know we want to be free of? We know we want to be living the life that God designed for us, life to the full, life in abundance, the adventure that God has for us. And we know that there are things in our life that have happened to us or by us that have caused us damage or caused other people damage, but continue to do so and we want to be free of. And I hope that by now you're starting to feel a release. If you have been genuinely working this program and working through the series that we've been doing, I hope that you're beginning to find that the power that those things once had on you no longer have that same power. Today we're going to be looking at two of the Beatitudes because they sort of have a similar sort of emphasis. And those Beatitudes are: blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. These two verses are linked, and up to now we've been dealing primarily with the battle for the mind, how we have interpreted our surroundings, we've interpreted the experiences that we've had, the things in our life that have shaped us, and the things that continue to impact upon us. And a large part of what we've been dealing with so far has been the battle for the mind. It's an internal process of finding peace by breaking the power that the experiences and beliefs that we've come to believe about ourselves are continuing to have. I believe inner healing is only fully complete when it starts to flow out from us and begin to impact onto other people. I remember many years ago talking with somebody who we were working with addiction, and somebody was talking about creating housing estates for people in recovery to be able to live together. And it sort of filled a number of us with horror, because in a sense you were creating ghettos where people were getting clean, but instead of being fully healed and fully recovered, you had just had a dry alcoholic or a dry drug addict who weren't actually re-entering society and engaging fully in society and becoming full contributors to society, because they were staying within their cohort. And I think there's something that for our healing to be complete, it needs to flow out of us and begin to impact other people. We pass the healing we've received onto other people, and that's what these two Beatitudes are talking about. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy, and blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Both of these Beatitudes speak of us taking actions towards other people that will be a blessing to other people in the way that we respond. If we look at our cycle of change, we have probably come to a place by now, I hope we've come to a place by now, where we start to recognise that our behaviours have hurt other people. Maybe they've hurt ourselves, they've hurt God, but maybe they've hurt other people. And consequently, there's a need for some repair work to be done. And our cycle of change, in most recovery programs, they would talk about a maintenance step. We're talking here about maintaining the progress that we are making, and we do that work, that sense of the healing that we've experienced flowing out to benefit other people, happens as we begin to release forgiveness towards other people. And that is what these two Beatitudes at the heart are challenging us to do. This area of forgiveness is a massive challenge for many people. There are so many barriers that we have to forgiveness. Often I think that those are rooted in having a wrong understanding of what forgiveness means. And to help us begin to consider how we release forgiveness, I think it's first of all to look at what some of the barriers are that we need to overcome. First of all, I think there's a barrier that where we feel if we forgive, we're letting people off the hook. They're getting away with what they did. In all of this this series, I don't want to minimise some of the things that you've been through. For some people, you've been through horrific life events that were not your fault. And as you've worked this programme and you've looked at some of the things, there's a light bulb moment where you suddenly go, it wasn't my fault, and we can release the sense of holding on to something that isn't ours to carry. And I've seen tremendous freedom come to people when they realise that. But for a lot of the time, if something's been horrific that's been done to us, when I've worked with people who've been abused, it's not that person's fault what that person did to them. They had no right to use their free will to abuse that person. And yet why are we in the place of being the one who has to forgive somebody who's done something wrong? We feel like by doing so, we're letting them get away with it, we're letting them off the hook. It's really important to realise that actually the hook is something which is causing us pain. Being connected and staying connected to that memory, it's like there's a chain that's holding the two of you and is linking the two of you together, that all the time you don't forgive. You've got that person hooked on your line, but you're attached to that person. And forgiving is actually allowing the line to break. You're breaking the chain, you're taking the hook out of the other person's mouth and separating yourself from that ongoing connection. It's quite clear that God says it's mine to revenge. And we can actually know that when we release somebody, we're letting them off of our hook, we're not letting them off of God's hook. And linked with that sometimes is actually we think it's not our responsibility to forgive. We are the victim here. Actually, the other person needs to be asking us for forgiveness. But for that whole sense of breaking the connection that holds us, whether we like it or not, we may not have been responsible for what that person did to us, but the impacts of what they did to us are still hurting us. They're still causing us damage today. We're still living with the effects of what was done to us. And so releasing forgiveness is actually about releasing ourselves from the power and the control that person still has over us because of the damage that was caused to us. But I always say at this point, it's really important that we insert the phrase wherever appropriate, because it truly isn't appropriate every time to go to the person who's wronged us and to meet with that person. For starters, we may be talking to a parent about a parent who's passed away. It's not possible to go to that person and ask for forgiveness. And so sometimes it's not physically possible or practical. But sometimes, and particularly when we're dealing with issues where we've been abused, where we're dealing with the victims of sexual abuse, to actually go and meet the abuser is most of the time completely inappropriate. And so if we think that forgiveness means we've actually got to go and see the person, then we've got a wrong perspective. We don't have to see the person in order to release forgiveness. Forgiveness is a choice. Forgiveness is a decision that we make, and we don't have to see that person in order to release forgiveness. However, it's also important that we don't use that as an excuse, because there are some people that it is important that we go to and we face up to them and release forgiveness. There is a power in being open and vulnerable to somebody when you offer forgiveness. We need to learn how to release forgiveness appropriately and healthily. And I came across a quote recently. I can't remember who it's from, it's not one of mine, but I thought, I like that so much I'm going to borrow it. And the quote was, "We repeat what we don't repair." And I think that's a really powerful image. We repeat what we don't repair. And unless we're willing to do that hard work of repair and releasing forgiveness, there is a danger that we continue to stay stuck in our journey. We stay stuck with our emotion, we stay stuck with our damage and our hurt and our pain, and we don't move into the fullness of life we're promised because we've stayed connected. and we end up repeating what we don't repair. And so I would encourage you to begin to rethink what forgiveness is. So if we're going to have a correct view of forgiveness, if we're going to approach forgiveness in the right way, how do we do that? The Beatitudes are positioned in the Bible at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of the largest recorded records of Jesus' teaching, where we see this picture of Jesus unpacking truth. And what we have, if we have the Beatitudes, and following the Beatitudes we have a number of chapters which some people would argue Jesus is unpacking the Beatitudes in more detail. And for what we're looking at as we're working through these Beatitudes and seeing how they're keys to us finding freedom, it might be helpful to look at how Jesus unpacks these Beatitudes and some of the things that he says. So if we begin and we work through, for example, in Matthew chapter 6, and all these are Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount. So we have the Beatitude, and then we have Jesus unpack it. And in chapter 6, he tells the people who are listening, he teaches his disciples how to pray. They've watched him praying, and they say, teach us how to pray. And so he gives the Lord's Prayer to his disciples. And the Lord's Prayer is probably one of those prayers that most people in the United Kingdom would probably know. I'm going to hazard a guess that most people would have heard them at some point and would be familiar with the Lord's Prayer. And what it is in effect is Jesus is giving people, his disciples, he's giving them a structure, a model of how to pray. We use it as a prayer, but it's probably a teaching tool that says when you pray, these are the sorts of things you need to do. But there's a key part in verse 12 where he says we need to pray, forgive us our sins as we have forgiven those who sin against us. It's almost as if the measure of forgiveness we will receive is directly proportional to the amount of forgiveness we're prepared to offer others. So if we're not prepared to offer forgiveness, why would we have a right to receive forgiveness ourselves? In chapter 7, Jesus unpacks that a little bit further, where he says, with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Again, we see this principle of what you're prepared to give is what you are likely to receive. And if you're not prepared to give, then what right do you have to receive that? So if you're somebody who withholds mercy, why would you have a right to mercy? In chapter 5, Jesus gives a really challenge where he says, if you're at the altar and you're offering your gift, and while you're there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift at the altar and first go and be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. That's a really interesting idea, that if we want to come and we want to come before God, then we need to be willing to keep short accounts. We need to have that sense if we know somebody has something against us, we need to be the one who puts it right. Often we think that the forgiveness needs to be initiated by the person who's done the wrong. But this passage of Jesus almost turns that around, that says, if someone's got something against you, you go and put it right. It changes the direction, it changes the emphasis. And he places the emphasis upon the person who wants to come to God and say, you know, here's my offering, here's my gift. You know, I often think in church when we come on a Sunday morning, you know, we'll come and we'll wave our hands and dance around and sing our songs and pat each other on the back and have a nice cup of tea and go home. But actually, the reality is, are we coming to do that and make our offering while we know someone's got something against us? And in chapter 7, Jesus gives what is sometimes called the golden rule. And that golden rule is, do to others what you would have them do to you. So Jesus is quite clear that when he's teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, he's teaching people who would follow him. He makes it very clear on multiple occasions that actually the attitude that we have towards other people will reap what we sow. And if we're not willing to offer forgiveness, then how much forgiveness will we receive in return? If we're not prepared to be peacemakers, how much peace will we receive? If we're not willing to offer mercy, how much mercy will we receive? Jesus actually makes it clear that forgiveness is not an option. If we truly want to be free and live life to the full, if we want to be free of the issues we have and achieve our potential, and if we want to be called a follower of God, then forgiveness is not optional. And if we have any doubt about that, let's not forget that while we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. So while we had no relationship with him, while we were still wrong, Jesus took the initiative towards us in order to make forgiveness possible. And so the challenge for us is, how do we approach forgiveness? We need to approach forgiveness that it's one of the non-negotiables of living true freedom. So if we see Jesus is telling us that forgiveness really isn't optional, it may be helpful at this point for us to put forgiveness into terms of repair. Remember, we repeat what we don't repair. And so if forgiveness is a tool to repair the damage that we've experienced, how do we do that? I want to introduce you to a process that I'm going to call the stages of repairing relationships. And I want you to think of the issue on your list. Think of the issue that you identified when you wrote on your piece of paper what it is you wanted to be free from. You know, as we went through the fourth Beatitude, maybe in there you've gone through and you've listed out the areas of your life that you want to work on. You know, you've now been given a pattern of how to deal with each of those issues in turn. But if you look at those issues and you see where the damage was, maybe it would help to think of each issue being a violation of trust. That actually when you were hurt or damaged, or when you hurt or damaged somebody else, or when you've held on to that issue in your life and you've hurt yourself, there's a violation of trust. And what we're trying to do is to repair that violation, repair that trust. And so to see forgiveness as a process that we work through that ends in peace or reconciliation, and I'll use peace or reconciliation here to help us put that into context, then we're in the business of repairing trust. And it's often said that once trust is broken, you've lost everything. And rebuilding trust is such a key part of rebuilding any relationship and coming into health. And there are different factors that influence that. We can be influenced by the environment that we're in. So, if we are in a certain culture, then, that may impact how we release forgiveness. The upbringing that we've had, the family dynamics that we grew up in, the family identity. I remember I was preaching once on family and forgiveness and parenting, and I was talking about the importance of releasing forgiveness by apologising to our children. And afterwards, one of my leaders came to me and effectively told me off and said, "You don't apologise to your children." Now, I really couldn't, I was gobsmacked. I couldn't believe that one of my leaders was coming to me with a real genuine belief that it was wrong to apologise to your children. To me, it's so important that we model to our children what we want them to copy. They will copy our example whether we like it or not. And if we're modelling these wrong behaviours, we may not realise it, but we're actually being an example to other people. And many of the people I work with who've committed horrendous offences, they were themselves victims before they were ever criminals. And many of them experienced things as a child growing up that no child should ever have to experience. And consequently, their understanding and perception of the world was completely skewed because of what they experienced in the culture growing up. And because of those environmental factors, sometimes it's very hard to approach forgiveness. And we need to recognise what those are and choose to go in an opposite spirit and go differently. Sometimes we can say there's been such a time gap that actually there's no point now. One of the most powerful stories of healing I've seen through working through some of this material was when we were when we were running the recovery program in my last church. One of my leaders was in her late 70s. I hope I've got that right. But as a young mum, she'd lost a baby in hospital, and in those days the baby was taken away, and they thought it was in the mother's interest to take the baby away at birth. The baby maybe breathed for an hour or so, and she never got to hold her baby. She never got to touch her baby. The baby was buried, cremated, without her having been part of the process. She had nothing to hold or touch or connect herself with this loss. Everybody had done everything for her, dealt with the death certificate, and she had carried with her for 40 years the pain of losing that child. And when she worked through this process and released that forgiveness, she came to a place of such freedom and power that she became one of the most powerful leaders that I had. She was such a witness and a testimony to so many other people of the power of God to transform life. But it happened 40 years earlier, really made no difference for her. She'd lived with the pain for that long. And maybe what you've been living with is a pain that has been going on for 40 years or more. It's never too late to deal with the issue and come into freedom. How we approach forgiveness is also key. We can approach it with genuineness, or we can approach it with insincerity. You know, we can approach somebody and say, "Oh, will you forgive me?" Or you can go, "Actually, please, I've really done wrong. Will you forgive me?" Remember, Jesus told the story of the tax collector and the Pharisee using all these posh words, and the tax collector literally hiding his face and beating his chest and saying, "Have mercy on me, a sinner." There is a way to approach forgiveness with a genuineness that makes a difference. How it's offered is key. And also the strength of a relationship is really important. If we've rebuilt relationships and we've established a new strength with those relationships, then actually the strength of those relationships mean we can be in a safe place to begin to offer forgiveness. As we do this, it's helpful to ask ourselves some questions. What were the circumstances around the issue? Is it appropriate for me to go to the other person and see them in person, or do I need to do forgiveness between me and God and forgive that person in proxy? What are we feeling? What emotions are being stirred up by doing this? And it's quite possible that as we go through this process, there will be tears, there will be pain. There will be that sense of things coming to the surface that we thought we'd buried for a long time. Remember that our brokenness causes us pain, and the effects of denial are to leave us with frozen emotions. The impact of fear is to leave us paralysed. And as we break out of that, and as we come into freedom, as we release forgiveness, those emotions start to come to the surface. We start to feel again where maybe we felt numb for so many years. And asking ourselves the question of, who do I need to forgive? Do I need to forgive another person? Or actually, do I need to forgive myself? Maybe I've been beating myself up for years. We've been carrying the sense of regret. Why did I make the choices I made? We make the choices we make at the time for a variety of reasons. And sometimes we make choices based on the information available to us at the time. Hindsight, as my wife tells us regularly, hindsight is a wonderful teacher but a rubbish judge. And when we look back, sometimes we are very self-critical of what we've done. But actually, what would we say to a friend in that situation? And releasing forgiveness to ourselves is actually part of being kind to ourselves and allowing ourselves to get ourselves off of our own hook. But maybe we also need to forgive God, and that may seem a really strange concept. But for many of us, we may have used the words, God, why did you allow that to happen? You know, God, if only you'd stepped in. God, if only that you'd allowed that situation to be different, I wouldn't have had what I've had. And we've been carrying resentments against God because of what's gone on. And maybe we also need to ask God to forgive us for the wrong that we've done to him. That's part of this process of repentance, and part of an approach of coming into a relationship with God is to ask him to forgive us for the things that we've done that have caused pain, the sin that has separated us from him. We need to let go of what we're carrying and let God have it, and that's what forgiveness did or does for us. Jesus' death on the cross broke the power of sin and broke the power of death. And often we talk about, you know, having eternal life and Jesus' death giving us eternal life. But Jesus' death also broke the power of sin. And so the devil would have you in a lie that says that you're locked in and you can never get out of this. But Jesus broke the power of that. When he died, he said, it is finished. The debt is paid in full. So there are no more rights of ownership. But once we come and release forgiveness, we're renouncing those rights of ownership that the devil has. And it allows us to come into true freedom where he can no longer have a claim on that area of our life.